Welcome everyone, Zach the Incredible Impression here. You guys are in for a treat today because we...
Hey, Scat, this is my show to host.
Okay. I'm going to let a very special guest introduce this one, so I'll be right back. And you call yourself a YouTube star. Anyway, hi folks, you may remember me. I'm Groucho Marx. And what you're gonna see today is, wait a minute. This isn't right, this is color film. Where's my old-fashioned black and white? I wonder how they do that. Folks, what you're about to see today is, I guess, an incredible impression, another one of those wild, chaotic videos with this loony bin over here. And he's going to be interviewing an old friend of mine, Mr. Steve Stoliar. So sit back, relax, enjoy the film, and while you're at it, tell him Groucho sent you. Hey, you guys, it's Zach the Incredible Impression here. We have got a wonderful gift today. I am talking to Groucho Marx's secretary from, I don't want to say back in the day, but the man who knew Groucho Marx probably better than anybody else that's alive today, Mr. Steve Stoliar. How you doing, Steve?
I'm doing fine, Zachary, and yourself?
I am doing great, absolutely, and it is such an honor to be able to talk to you. We've got our friends here in the background.
Yes,
So,
but they're all doing their Harpo impression. I haven't heard a peep out of any of the three of them.
There you go. Harpo
okay.
just said something. And Van Chico's just about to say something. I'm not sure. I don't know. Maybe he's a fall off the shelf. I don't know.
I know that there are people who knew Groucho better than I did who are still around, but they're not on your show, so I'll accept your introduction as stated.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Now, first of all, give us a little background about yourself. Not just with Groucho and the Marx Brothers, but you also have other things. So I'm going to hand the floor to you.
Well, the least you could have done is vacuum and sweep. Oh, I see what you mean. You see, this is silliness, boys and girls. This is a grown man, assuming I'm a grown man. I could be a midget, you can't really tell, being silly. I was born in St. Louis, and our family moved out here in 1962 when I was 7. And on the plane from St. Louis to Los Angeles, Red Skelton was sitting directly in front of us, and a few rows ahead of him was Andy Griffith. And this was when their shows were at the height of their popularity. And Red Skelton kept my sisters and me entertained the whole flight doing different things. He had a little pop gun in the inside pocket of his sport coat, and he would, from time to time, take it out and push the back, and the cork on a string would pop out. You'd never get past the airline security now, but in 62, you could carry a loaded cork pop gun and I thought, wow, it really is like on I Love Lucy. There's movie stars everywhere. We haven't even landed in Los Angeles, and there's 2 big stars here. So it was always a big deal about celebrities. When we moved out here, my mom would often slow the car down and say, "Is that somebody?" Their value being someone she recognized from a movie or TV, or she'd come back from being at the grocery store and say, "I saw Simon Oakland at Gelson's. He was in West Side Story," and Psycho.
Wow.
So it was always, they were always separate. You hear they put their pants on one leg at a time, and that's true, but there was something special and magical about people who had been in the entertainment world.
Absolutely.
And I grew up with a fascination for old movies, old comedians, silent movies. I loved the Universal horror films, the classic Frankenstein, Dracula, Wolfman, Mummy, Werewolf of London, Raven, Black Cat movies. And I loved Laurel and Hardy and Buster Keaton. And
Yes.
I discovered the Marx Brothers officially around high school, but they seemed very familiar at the time because my parents would quote lines from their films, like being vaccinated with a phonograph needle. And I had an Uncle Joe in St. Louis who was a balding man that smoked a cigar and had a mustache and glasses and would wiggle his eyebrows. So when I saw Groucho on TV, I thought, well, he's just like Uncle Joe. And I just really responded to their seamless blend of physical comedy and really clever, witty dialogue. I mean, the Three Stooges were more physical, but that's if your taste is to seeing someone draw a saw over somebody's head and hit him in the face.
Right.
And I loved the jokes, the wordplay, the double entendres and spoonerisms and all that.
Yes.
And I had always had a passion for history and archaeology and paleontology. And I figured I would go into something like that when I grew up. And in fact, was a history major at UCLA.
Wow.
But then through a remarkable set of circumstances, got the opportunity to work for my idol, Groucho, inside his house for the last 3 years of his life, and ended up shifting my major from history to motion picture television and pursuing writing as a career, although I still have a passion for fossils and Roman artifacts and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And then we're getting ahead, but after Groucho died and I was in need of a job, I got a job at Universal Studios typing scripts every day from 11 in the morning to 8 at night in the steno.
Wow.
Rockford Files, Columbo, $6 Million Man,
Wow.
Kojak, all of those 70s things, and then scripts to Animal House and Coal Miner's Daughter and Melvin and Howard, and just pushing paper through my Selectric 2 typewriter. And I had begun communicating with talk show host Dick Cavett while I was at Groucho.
Yes.
And he ended up hiring me to be a writer for him in the early 80s. He was getting a show at HBO, and they asked him who he wanted to be a writer, and he suggested me. So I left LAX as a secretary and arrived at JFK as this writer from Los Angeles.
Oh, wow.
And
that must have been a welcome to you.
It was an astonishing experience drinking in Manhattan, and I had such a passion for the Algonquin Round Table and the whole theatrical literary world of New York in the 20s, and then Woody Allen from the 60s onward and all that. And when work dried up there, I was hired back in LA, and so I moved back and wrote episodes of TV shows like Murder, She Wrote and Simon and Simon and Sliders and the new WKRP in Cincinnati.
Right.
And I also have had a flair. I know you can't relate to this, but I've had a flair for doing impressions ever since I was a kid. And I tend to go, even though there's not much money in it, I tend to go for people that nobody else does because there's no competition. I mean, I'm particularly attracted to the character actors of the 30s and 40s rather than the standard Jimmy Cagney thing. And so when I was on Gilbert Gottfried's podcast for the first of 3, we had great fun trading obscure impressions. And I have I've gotten to be friends with Woody Allen since the Groucho days, and
Oh, wow.
he sent me a copy of his memoir, Apropos of Nothing, and
Wow.
he inscribed it for Steve, not just a great friend, but he does Franklin Pangborn. Oh, Gloria Jean.
Oh,
That
jeez.
guy from the W.C. Field. Oh, really, Mr. Fields? This is ridiculous.
Oh,
Anyway,
yeah.
um, so I traded off doing voice work. I did voice work for animation for some of the Peanuts specials and Frosty
I
the.
did not know that. Wow.
Well, you asked. This is the short answer to your question. Um, and I wrote a book about my Groucho days called Raised Eyebrows, My Years Inside Groucho's House. And
Yes.
Dick Cavett wrote the introduction. And Woody Allen provided a great dust jacket blurb that said it was one of the best books about a show business icon he'd ever read. And we are currently in the midst of developing it into a motion picture with
Wow.
Jeffrey Rush as the older Groucho and Sienna Miller as the young, ambitious Aaron Fleming, who was the woman
Right.
that came into Groucho's life towards the end and alienated the family and old time friends. And
Yeah.
it was a lot for me to go through at 20 to try to balance these egos and moody people. But it was a stunning experience. I mean, just to be able to sit with Groucho in his house and talk to him, all these questions that I'd had for years. All I ever wanted to do was shake his hand and thank him for all the laughs. And I didn't think that would ever happen because he was in his 80s and had strokes and hardening of the
Right.
arteries. And I thought that they're just, I can't imagine the nexus of our worlds. But
Yeah.
because I started a committee when I was a student at UCLA to put pressure on Universal to untangle a legal mess and bring out animal crackers for the first time in decades. That's
Yes.
what put me in touch with Groucho's people. And he came to UCLA one day in 1974, and we sat side by side, surrounded by dozens and dozens of kids in t-shirts, blue jeans, and tennis shoes, and a crush of cameras talking about trying to get this old Marx Brothers movie re-released. And we were successful. And then I was offered the job of working in his house as his secretary and archivist, putting together all of his memorabilia, letters and photos and clippings. And the history part of me loved the fact that he was a man from 1890, that, I was able to ask him all these questions about what life was like at the turn of the century. I mean,
Yes.
he he was born in New York, but when he was born, Queen Victoria was still on the throne in England. She still had another 11 years. And
Wow.
his, I mean, he remembered the Wright brothers' flight and witnessed the moon landing.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
So, I asked him once, how far back do you remember? And he said, I guess the Spanish American War, which was 1898. And
Yeah.
I mean, to realize, and then of course, the fact that he was personal friends with these mythic creatures like W.C. Fields and George
Yes.
Gershwin and Kaufman and Irving Berlin. I mean, that he knew them as friends, and toured in vaudeville with W.C. Fields, and
Yes.
plus being Groucho Marx, a guy with a mustache, and some of my favorite movies. So it was a
Right.
rich experience, and I got to meet a lot of the people from his writers and directors. I knew their names from seeing them roll by on the movies, and also from the book The Groucho Letters, because he would correspond with them over the years.
Yes. Yes.
So I
I
got
heard
to
of that.
meet
Yes.
Maury Riskind and S.J. Perelman and Nat Perrin and Irving Brecker and the people from You Bet Your Life like George Fenneman. And then
Right.
there were also like Mae West and Bob Hope and George Burns and Jack Lemmon and Steve
Yes.
Allen, just a staggering array of people I admired. And what was cool was that since I was such an obsessive Marx Brothers fan at the time, I knew who all these people were. I didn't have to grow up and go, oh, if only I knew then what I know now, I would have appreciated them. Instead, my brain was just this Rolodex. It's like, oh, Nat Parent, he co-wrote Monkey Business and Duck Soup and produced The Addams Family. Oh,
Yes. Yes.
he goes back to Broadway with Groucho and the Marx Brothers. And they appreciated the fact that this mutton chopped, tennis shod whippersnapper knew who the hell they were, and that I wasn't just into sex and drugs and rock and roll, and that they were a bunch of old fogies. So it was just a really rich atmosphere for me to be immersed in. And, you know, the two substantial drawbacks were getting close to my hero as he's fading out, and then
Yes.
dealing with the mercurial Aaron Fleming, because she was prone to fly into rages and throw things and slam doors and hire and fire people at will. So staying on the good side of someone who's like that is not for the squeamish, but
Right.
it certainly changed and impacted my life. And so that's the short answer to your question. Whatever.
Absolutely.
So
That's great, though.
have
Now,
at it. Is that enough
yeah.
for you to dissect and
Oh,
go?
yeah. I mean, you were mentioning your writing and stuff, but when you mentioned Aaron Fleming, were you with Groucho on the night that Jack Lemmon presented he and the Marx Brothers the honorary award?
I
Uh,
wasn't. That was after the Animal Crackers campaign. So I had met Aaron and I had met Groucho, but wasn't yet hired to work for him. And also, I would have to have been a member of the Academy to have been in attendance that
right.
night. But it was such a different experience watching the Oscars in '74, because there was Groucho, a guy that a couple months earlier I'd been sitting next to on Bruin Walk and exchanging conversation. And then he
Right.
thanked Aaron Fleming, and I thought, hey, I know her too. This is really cool. And at the time, I didn't know that our paths would ever cross again, because
Hmm.
I'd served my purpose in getting Animal Crackers out. And it was not until another couple of months when thankfully a couple of summer jobs fell through. And I thought, I have nothing to lose by asking if there's anything I can do for them. And lo and behold, there was. And that led to a 3-year gig inside the man cave.
Wow. Wow, that is awesome. I mean, that you have had such a gifted and incredible life, getting to meet your idol especially. I mean, how many people around in general can say, I only wanted to shake my idol's hand, but then, I ended up being like close friends with this person, or in
Yeah,
your case, I worked for him.
whether it's an actor or a rock star or a sports hero, people can relate to my story because they can
Yeah,
put themselves in my shoes and think, God, imagine if it was Elton John, or imagine if it was Babe Ruth, or
right.
whoever it is.
Well,
Uh,
my goal is to meet my idol, Paul McCartney, sometime. Because
it's funny because out of the vast array of people that I have met, and I really have done a pretty good job of meeting people, ask me, "Is there anyone you haven't met?" And I say, Paul.
wow,
So you and I have to go together and pester him, ring his bell and run or something.
yeah, that
Yeah,
would be good.
well,
I don't think he'd appreciate it, but
excellent taste in him being at the top of your list, because we have the same list, and
yeah.
everyone else is a distant second, I'm afraid.
Well, Ringo, even I would love to meet Ringo, but I've heard he's not the greatest people person anymore. I mean,
Yeah, I don't know, but a friend of mine had lunch with him some years back, and
oh wow,
Ringo was talking about when the group was going to break up, but it hadn't been officially announced. And he decided he was going to tell his mother to break the news to her before she had to hear it on the radio. So
Right.
he called her up and said, well, the boys, we're going to be breaking up, and I wanted to let you know. And there was a pause, and she said, maybe you could go back to playing some of the local clubs. She could only see it as my son is about to be unemployed. Never mind that he was fabulously wealthy for the rest of his life. Instead of seeing the news as the Beatles are breaking up, it's like, oh my God, my son is. I mean, that's such a typical parental. Maybe you could go back to playing. Maybe you could wait tables and play the drums in between.
That's a typical mother right there, though.
Right. I think
What's my
it's a
boy
great
gonna
story.
do next?
Maybe you could go back to playing some of the local clubs. Yeah.
Well, originally that's what they wanted to do, anyways. Until John said, "I'm out."
See if Rory Storm still needs a drummer.
Yeah, but apparently I heard that Rory especially was not very pleased that Ringo left, as was Pete Best. I mean, to this day, he does not like to talk about it.
Well, I'm still not sure exactly. I hear different reasons for why Pete was let go. None of them having to do with him choosing to leave. That he did not. People say, "Can you believe he quit the Beatles right before they made it big?" No, he was fired. And I've heard varying things. His personality clashed. He was the one that the girls were craziest about. So there was envy from Lennon and McCartney. He didn't have his hair cut by Astrid Kircher in the Beatles cut.
Right.
I've also heard that it was as simple as people saying Ringo was the superior drummer. I don't have a good enough ear, but you can, now on YouTube, you can hear some of the songs from '62 that Pete Best was drumming, and I can't tell the difference. But so I'm not sure what the reason is, but yeah, just as the train was pulling out of the station, they left him standing at the gate.
Right. Well, what I learned was I have the entire Beatles anthology collection from the '90s, and I have it on DVD. And if you watch the very first episode on the first disc, they talk about, or I think it's the second episode, they talk about when they went back to Hamburg for the second time. Pete was starting to miss a lot of shows in Hamburg. And he was turning up late and stuff, and people started the other guys like Paul especially started getting very annoyed with it, because a lot of times Ringo would actually be in Hamburg with Rory, and because Pete was late or something, they would have Ringo come in and fill in, and they started getting closer and closer to him. And at the same time, Pete was becoming more a loner from the group. And when they finally got the okay from George Martin at EMI, because George Martin was used to producing, comedy albums and stuff like that.
And classical.
Yes, a lot of classical music. And they came in and played a demo for George Martin. And George said, okay, I'll sign you, but on the condition that you use a session drummer for this first recording for Love Me Do. And then they said, okay, well, you know what? We're going to bring Ringo in because Pete's just not working out. He's not favoring, because Brian Epstein had come under management to them, I think shortly after Ringo joined. Right. But before that, Pete was he was not their type, and he couldn't really, I mean, there's even pictures of him in the Cavern Club playing, and he's kind of just leaning against the wall and just playing whatever he feels. And it's like he's not even feeling it. And they said, and they said Ringo was the one that they really loved, and they loved his style. And Paul always says, we were nothing until he joined. And then Ringo says, "Oh yeah, I second." He goes, "Oh yeah, I second that." You wanted me. And Paul turns to him and goes, "No, wait a minute, I was joking. You begged to join us. You just had to." And
I haven't
but
watched that in a long time. I saw it when it was first on, but I
yeah,
haven't watched the anthology since then. But yeah, well,
yeah,
that sounds like an organic series of events then. But
yes,
I never got to meet any of the Beatles, although
wow,
I did meet Billy Preston.
really.
I
Well,
did.
I think he really added a lot of great stuff to
Well,
the Let It Be album.
you see it in the recently restored footage. The
Yes.
shot of adrenaline he added with his enthusiasm and musicality when he started coming into the sessions. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, if you look at them at Twickenham Film Studios trying to work together, that's before Billy came into the picture, and you can see that's when Paul and George had that falling out. I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I
I
won't play
want
at
to
all.
please you.
Yeah, and then George left. He
Yeah.
was like, "I'm out," and then they abandoned Twickenham. They moved into Apple there on Savile Row, and then George said, "I think we need something extra on these songs," and he knew that Billy was around, so he put a message out to Billy and said, "Hey, stop into Savile Row. The lads don't know that you're going to come, but I know you will make this atmosphere a whole lot better." The minute he showed up,
Yeah.
the atmosphere just got
Yeah.
much,
The
much
energy level.
easier.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, but yeah, I was in two Beatles tribute bands back in the day. And those
Which
days are
day was
behind me
that?
now. What's that?
Which day was that?
Which day was that?
You said back
Uh,
in the day. See, this
yeah.
is part of the influence. This is part of the influence that Groucho had on me because
I thought so.
he let me interview him for a school project, and I said, there's an election around the corner, and which corner? What? Which corner? Just around the corner. And anyway, you can't just say around the corner. It has to be a specific corner. So I know I absorbed that. Steve Allen was the same way, taking something
Yes.
literally and handing it back to the people and saying, "Well, you're flabbergasted. And if you've ever had
Right.
asked flabbered, you know how painful that can be," or something like that.
Right.
Anyway, so that's
And
were you one of the four specifically, or were you
I
filling in?
was Ringo, actually. I was Ringo in both. I played in a band from Ohio called Abbey Road, and I played quite a few shows with them. And then another group of guys and I got together, tried to do a new band called Beatlemania: The Invasion. But the our Paul was like, he was the one who formed the group, but he would not let anybody have a say in it. He was like, "This is my band. This is how we're going to do
Oh,
things."
that's him doing his Paul impression by
Yeah,
taking over that part of
yeah.
his
And
personality.
so we all said, "We're leaving. We don't need this." And he found himself without a band. And ever since then, from what I understand, he's been going downhill.
Oh,
So
well,
I said to him, "You're never going to get anywhere ordering people around. You have to have fair share of say between the group." And he says, "Well, that's not how I do my business."
well, if you have the chops, I mean, there are people with colossal egos that behave that way and still, like, apparently Al Jolson was just a monster like
Right.
that and would just, come out during intermission and say, you know, uh, ladies and gentlemen, what's going to happen now is the guy's going to lose a girl, all right? And then he's going to be upset, and then he's going to meet her again and apologize, and they'll live happily ever after. Now, do you want to see that, or do you want to hear me sing? And they'd
Yeah.
scream and shout, and then he'd sing for
Right.
45 more minutes. He could get away with it, I mean, you hear about some of the people with monstrous egos to back it up, but it is uh, at Groucho's 84th birthday party. Jack Lemmon and Harpo's son Bill were talking. And
Yes.
I overheard Bill Marx say, you know, Jack, there are so many jerks in this business, but I have to tell you, you are a genuinely nice guy. And
Yes.
Lemon said, well, thanks, but I mean, there's no reason not to be. And at the time, I remembered thinking it was just sort of a gracious way of taking the compliment. But then I
Right.
realized there is no reason not to be a nice guy.
Exactly.
There's sort of two philosophies. There are the people who don't trust anyone until that trust is earned, and there's a case to be made for that. Then there's the people who trust others until they're crossed, and there's a case to be made for that. I tend to be in the latter group, and so
Right.
was Lemon, as opposed to like, I'm going to have this exterior of being a son of a bitch, and then if you can chip through that, then you've accomplished something. But those
Yes.
they seem just sort of perfunctory at the time. Well, there's no reason not to be a nice guy. But he's right. And so anyway, I'm sorry that happened to your Paul. But
Yeah.
so
It's
are you?
all good.
So that means that you're quite good at the drums in order to be
Yes.
a bingo guy.
Yes.
Well,
I don't have my drums anymore though. I sold them because I'm not doing Beatles anymore because I'm focusing specifically on acting and stuff.
right.
And so, I always felt the urge, the temptation would be there to try to go back into the Beatlemania thing. And if I do that, I'm going to lose sight of where I'm heading. And I don't want to get off track. And I don't want to, be in a good spot where I'm about to, make my big break in acting. And then somebody says, oh, well, take your kid out of storage, let's go and start a Beatle thing because having all the equipment and stuff is gonna temptation's gonna come in and grab me by the throat and say, you belong in this, you belong in this. Yet I know where my heart belongs in acting. But it's like, oh, come on, you did this before. This is easier and stuff. And so I got rid of my gear just, mainly to prove to myself that
You don't
I'm
need
not doing this. Right.
that the sticks were tiny little crutches and you threw them.
Right. Exactly. Now, a lot of people may not know this, but Chico was not the first Marx brother born, was he? There was
when
another one.
when when Groucho's biographer was a very nice guy named Hector Arce, who was sort of like a
Hmm.
brother to me, and he was a great guy. And when he was working on his biography of Groucho, cleverly titled Groucho, um, we were trying to get certain records uh, to establish dates and places and all that because so much had been anecdotal, and it's like, well, if this is going to be a definitive biography, we want to be able to get that. So we sent for a photostat of Groucho's birth certificate, and where it said number of previous children 3, number of children present counting the newborn 3. And I thought that doesn't make sense.
Right.
It's Chico, Harpo, and Groucho. That's the 3. How
Right.
can you both previous and current when you add one? I wasn't good
Right.
with math, but that. So Hector and I went into Groucho's room, and we said, "Did your parents have a child before Chico?" And Groucho looked up and said, "Yes, his name was Manfred. They referred to him as Manny, and he died in infancy." And I said, "You know what he died of?" And Groucho said, "Old age."
Yeah.
Uh, so there was this Manfred. Now, since then, people have said, "Oh, I knew about Manfred," and it's like, well, that's fine, but you weren't in the household. No one else in the household had ever heard any reference to this, and none of the
Right.
other, Groucho's grandson. Nobody. It was like Chico was the oldest. He was the firstborn. Da 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 da. But because of this weird number of previous children 3, current number 3, that led to an out of, very matter of factly, yeah, Manfred. Then he died when he was a baby. So we'll
Right.
never know what he would have grown up to do, what his skills would have been, in
If
the
you had to
first
take a
order.
guess, do you think Manford might have joined up with his brothers? I mean, Minnie Marx was she was a sister of the late Alcine, wasn't
Right.
she? And
Yes,
do you
Schoenberg.
think
Yeah,
she would have followed his brothers?
probably. Whether I think many push them into show business to bring in money. So it doesn't
Right,
necessarily mean that Manfred would have been a gifted musician or wit,
right,
but they would have found something for him to do. Because I mean, like Gummo, which is the brother people are least familiar with
right,
for Manfred, Gummo was in the act from the beginning until World War One when he was drafted and had to go off and fight. And so they brought in Zeppos at 17-year-old, the baby of the family, to fill
right,
in as the straight man. Um, you don't really, even reading vaudeville reviews, you don't read reviews that spotlight Gummo as this electrifying presence on stage or brilliant singer,
right,
something like that. So the fact that he was in the act doesn't mean that he was on equal par with Harpo and Groucho and Chico as a performer. So we'll never know. It's all conjecture, but I don't know why Minnie would have exempted him from being, as she's shooing the chicks out with her apron, to go off and
right,
find birdseed. I don't see why he would have been exempted. So, yeah, I'm
right.
assuming the act would have included him until he either, sprouted wings or decided I don't need this. I'm going to go be a necktie.
Right. And there is a lot of confusion out there. There's a lot of confusion over the correct pronunciation of Chico's name. If you
True.
Google it and you ask him to read it back or whatever, and if you look up the pronunciation on Google, it clearly says and labels it Chico,
Right.
and it
Which is
spells it Cheeko.
right, which is how I assumed it was pronounced for many years.
Same here.
And even in old shows, I mean, even shows where he's guest starring, they'll say, and our special guest tonight is Chico Marx of the Marx Brothers. And he doesn't
Right,
stop them and say, hey, there's some mispronunciation going on there. But technically, and in fact, it was Chico because he chased and frequently caught chicks. He was a notorious womanizer, and he
right,
was very charming with his suggestive eyes and crooked smile and his astonishing skill at the piano, which brought
right,
people over to hang out there. And then he was just compulsively unfaithful to his wife and also
right.
a compulsive gambler who would throw away good cards in a hand to make the game more exciting. But it is pronounced Chico by those in the know. And
Wow.
you can hear Groucho referring to him as Chico on uh, an evening with Groucho Carnegie Hall double album
Yes.
from '72. But most people think it, because there's the Chico and the Man and Chico
Right.
Hamilton, the jazz musician. So it's
Right.
an understandable thing. But to be technically correct, it's Chico.
Yes. Yes. And I mean, I saw you were you appeared in a biography about the Marx Brothers a couple years ago with interviews with Groucho's son, Arthur. And there was a whole bunch of other people that were interviewed and stuff. But when you had you after in the beginning you had mentioned Manfred, then the narrator came on and was talking about Leonard. He would eventually earn the nickname Chico. And there's an interview with Chico saying, I got my name at 15. I used to chase the chickens. I didn't know that he meant women. I thought
Oh,
he meant actual chickens.
yeah. I mean, that's another thing that's tough for some people is you have to understand we're discussing people and material and references from over 100 years ago. And
Mhm.
so much of their material had to do with slang expressions because no one was thinking, what if 100 years from now they don't know who Chick Sale is or they don't know
Right.
who Chicken Chaser is? So you sort of have to do a bit of Googling to find out. I mean, in Horse Feathers, Thelma Todd plays Connie Bailey, and she's referred to as the college widow. Now,
Yes.
there's no explanation for that because in
Right.
1932, people knew what it was. There had been a very
Hmm.
successful play called The College Widow, and it was a phrase that basically meant a woman who lived near a college and would have affairs with students, and then the students would graduate. So it sort of made her a widow as each class would graduate until she hooked up with some new person, and so she was the perennial college widow.
Yes.
But you can't expect people 100 years later to know that, nor should you hold it against a movie.
Exactly.
Yeah, they should have called her something else because maybe no one will know what that is. That also gets
Right.
into stuff like controversies over racial stereotypes and language because at the time it was acceptable and it
Right.
isn't fair. I get really upset about political correctness, but I get more upset about retroactive political correctness when
Hmm.
people like blackface. If you
Yes. Al
if you
Jolson did that.
cancel all the people who worked in blackface, you would end up including Judy Garland and Fred Astaire
Oh,
and
yes.
Mickey Rooney. And it was not meant to demean or make them less than. Like when Fred Astaire did Bojangles of Harlem and Swing Time, it was a salute to Bill Bojangles Robinson. And you see
Right.
a featurette on Turner Classic Movies, and they say, of course, we are ashamed by these images today. And I've even heard from people saying, well, they should have just refused to play those roles. I blame the
Right.
actors. And it's like, you can't. You've got to go back in a time machine to a time. I put out a book of my father's wartime letters when he was fighting the Nazis in Europe during World War II. And
Right.
he talks about the Japs and he
Hmm.
talks about the Jerrys, the Krauts, and
Right.
the headline said, Japs bomb Pearl Harbor, and
Right.
you can't. It doesn't work to say, well, let's just call it the J word now because we
Yeah.
don't want to ruffle any feathers. So there are references in Marx Brothers movies, and people get upset, and it's like I saw an article about a year ago that some young lady had written a review of Monkey Business and was talking about how funny it was. And
Yeah.
then me, now being an elder statesman, even though I was the little whippersnapper kid at the time, now I'm of the age of saying, it's so nice to see young kids today appreciate. So she's writing about how funny the movie still is. And I thought, well, that's encouraging. And then
Yeah.
she says, but did anyone ever think it was funny to see Harpo chasing young girls all over the place? Did anyone ever find humor in, basically sexual harassment, unwanted
Right.
sexual, and you just want to strangle them? Uh,
Yeah.
but I understand that people view things through a different filter now, but I get hopping mad when they start projecting that onto something from, let's get rid of Gone with the Wind because it wasn't 12 Years a Slave. Well,
Right.
no, you see it in the context of the times and the person that, Margaret Mitchell grew up in the postbellum South. And anyway,
Yes.
let me hop off my soapbox and get
Yeah.
back
I
to you.
mean, I'm only 38, but I was raised on, the Three Stooges, Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, and stuff. And I have such an appreciation for that era
Mhm.
that, I feel, you know,
I mean, I watch the Marx Brothers or I watch the Three Stooges or what have you, and I think, boy, it would have been great to be around back then because times were so innocent. You could get away with,
Yeah.
slapping somebody and even knocking somebody out, and it would be funny.
Well, you're
Now,
probably aware of the fact that Seinfeld has stopped appearing at colleges because he
yeah,
said it's too many eggshells to walk on. You say something and you get people either hissing or going, "Oh, he said that," and it's death for a comedian to have to self-edit all along the way for fear. I think oh God, what's the name of the Ricky Gervais said
yes,
he said, and I made this a meme and I'll often post it on Facebook when people start to get prickly. He said, just because you're offended doesn't mean you're right.
right, right.
And because you'll hear from people and they'll say, I find that offensive. And they expect you to remove it. And instead, I will say, noted or I understand. And then they don't know what to do with that. It's like, don't you know, if I tell you it hurts my feelings, you have to get rid of it. No, I
Right.
don't.
No,
You're free to unfriend me or block me or not, or just scroll to the next post.
Mhm.
But I'm not bending to, like Gervais said, just because you're offended doesn't mean you're right. So,
right.
yeah. And I also can't imagine what it must have been like to see them live on stage. The Marx Brothers, the Three
Yes,
Stooges, Fred and Adele Astaire. Can you imagine not just in a movie house, but actually seeing them live on? But it was a different time. Fred Astaire said he said he preferred the theater to films because the audience would leave with a specific memory of what they'd seen instead
yes,
of being able to examine it up close over and over again. And he also
yes,
said, and this shows you how times have changed, he could tell when the caliber of the audience was starting to decline when he looked out over the footlights and the men were only in black tie.
yes, yes,
As white tie was more formal than black tie. Well, now black tie is very, very rare and represents the ultimate. It's like if you're going to meet the president, we wear black tie. But
right.
he saw that as a sign of decline. It's like, uh-oh, the
Yes,
white ties are being taken over by only black tie tuxedos and top hats. So
yeah.
it was the 20s. So before.
And a lot of people, though, I mean, I recently, just a few months ago, I was watching, as I said, that the biography on the Marx Brothers that you're featured in. I actually, and many people may not realize this, Groucho did not have a real mustache for the longest time, did he?
No, and it was only when I started seeing original photos instead of dupes of dupes of dupes. If you get
Mhm.
original photos from the 30s, and you can see quite clearly that it isn't even a pasted on mustache, but it's just a smear of grease paint. And the
Right.
story behind that was that on the stage, he used to apply an artificial mustache, which meant
Hmm.
uh, making sure you're shaved, then putting on what's called spirit gum, which is like
Right.
glue, and then making sure you've centered the fake mustache and patting it out, and then
Yes.
waiting for it to dry so it doesn't start coming unglued when you're talking,
Right.
and then going out. And one night he was late getting to the theater and he went into his dressing room and realized he only had a few minutes. So he stuck his finger in the grease paint and smeared it across his upper lip. And he said he got exactly the same number of laughs he got
Oh, wow.
when he had a fake mustache. The audience didn't care. And so that
Right.
the fake eyebrows and mustache became part of his look. But even when they were making their first film, The Coconuts, the
Hmm.
producer said, you can't wear a grease paint mustache in a movie. And Groucho said, why not? And he said, they're not going to believe it. It's a one thing to do it on the stage, And Groucho said, they're not going to laugh any differently. I'm not going to, and he refused to do it. And of course, now it seems ludicrous that they were worried about things like that.
Right.
But also, when Coconuts was made in 1929, sound movies were only like 2 years old. And
Right.
people and studios and theaters still weren't quite sure how audiences understood what they were watching. So when Coconuts was being filmed, the producers insisted whenever there was a song, there had to be the orchestra showing in the footage,
Right.
because otherwise people will want to know where the music's coming from. Because in a theater, there's an orchestra pit and the musicians are down there. But
Yes.
if people are singing in a movie and you hear violins and trumpets and all that, people are going to want to know, is there an orchestra behind the screen, whatever. So they spent all sorts of money dressing up the musicians, and then
Right.
they were generally not caught in the frame of the film. And of course, nobody cared, but they just weren't sure.
Right.
George Kaufman said to the producer, the guy says, there's something I want to tell you, and the girl says, what is it? And the guy says this, and then he sings a song that he loves her, and then it's fine.
Mhm.
And it was like, no, that you can't do it in a movie. It's fine on the stage. So yeah, everybody was feeling their way in those early movies. Also, the first two that they did, Coconuts and Animal Crackers,
Mhm.
um, they didn't. There were no boom microphones yet. They had to have a
Right.
stationary mic, and you had to be near it. I mean, you see it parodied in "Singing in the Rain" when they convert dueling cavalier to dancing cavalier or singing cavalier or whatever,
Right.
and having to hide the microphone here and there. And it's true. The sound engineer was like in an airtight wooden box so that his machines wouldn't make money, and then he would kind of come out for air between takes. But when they came to California in 31 to do Monkey Business, it's like they were shot out of a cannon, because they had the freedom of boom microphones. And so they were all over the deck of the ship and the party scene and a barn and all these things. But in the first couple, you see that there isn't a lot of moving around while they're talking. And
Right.
you can see when Zeppo comes down the stairs at the beginning of Animal Crackers, he says, I represent the captain who insists on my informing you of these conditions under which he comes here.
Right. Yes.
And it's because he's turning away from the microphone. Now,
Yes.
unfortunately, they've sort of balanced the audio in the most recent release of the film. And so
Mhm.
it's easy for me to make that point when I show it to people, because the 20 somethings that restored it thought, oh, look, the audio drops out here, let's boost it up. But that to me was part of the archaeological interest of these early sound movies.
Right. Right. And of course, I heard this somewhere, but since you knew Groucho personally, you asked him literally everything that there was to know. Um, is it true that Harpo used pantomime and employed props because he was not good at remembering lines, or he?
I think so. I think, that's of course really getting into antiquity, because this gets into vaudeville and the teens.
Right.
But I don't think he had a facility for delivering lines and possibly remembering the dialogue. So they
Right.
gave him fewer and fewer, and that restriction, necessity was the mother of invention. That
Oh yes.
restriction caused the blossoming of him as pantomime and as a mute expressing himself with whistles and
Right.
shapes and things like that. And that just became his persona, and it was much easier for him, as isn't it? Didn't have to worry about. And when you see scripts to the films, it'll say Chico says this, Groucho says this, Chico says this, Groucho says this, and then in parentheses it'll say Harpo business, and it's
Yeah.
like that there's going to be something there that he does, but you
But he
don't
wa- he
have
was great at improvising on that stuff.
Well,
Wasn't
yeah, I mean, by
he?
the time they did it for the film, it was they didn't just say, "Okay, now do something," because they needed to rehearse it. And but
Right,
you could. It was very hard to write for Harpo
right,
because it was physical business and then the songs.
right. And I mean, the thing is that I wonder about, seeing, all of the footage and stuff. I know how, bull horns work, or like, bulbous horns work. And, you squeeze a bulb horn and it'll make a sound both as you squeeze it and as it's coming, as you let it go. I
Yeah.
noticed Harpo's horns always just, worked when he pushed on them. But I didn't know. And I mean, the long pipe that he had, I don't think that could even make a noise if you squeezed it.
I
I
don't
don't
know.
know if that was sound effects
That's a
or
good.
what.
Well, in some of the cases, they could, like they would, like when Harpo's on the phone in Duck Soup,
Yes,
you can
that's
hear
what.
it's a muted trumpet going.
Right,
That he's not doing that with a rubber bulb horn. But
right,
in terms of, I never thought of what you said, which is that what about when the bulb has to reinflate? Doesn't it also,
right.
That's a good question for Bill Marx, but I don't know the answer to
Yeah, I
that.
mean, Bill Marx is still around, isn't he?
He is indeed.
And are all of Harpo's children still alive? He had 4 or 5 children,
I
I think.
think one of them is gone. I met another one, Jimmy, a few years ago. Very nice
Mhm.
guy. And there was Minnie, and all the Marx children named their daughters with an M in honor of their mother Minnie. So you had
Wow.
Maxine and Miriam and like Minnie.
Hmm.
I
Wow.
did know Maxine, who was Chico's daughter, and she was quite a pistol.
Right. Now,
She,
Chico, of
yeah,
course, I mean,
yeah.
Chico had an over exaggerated Italian accent, but I mean, that again, that was just a character
Oh my
accent.
God, it's cultural appropriation. We need to
Right,
cancel Chico Marx. Why didn't he get a real Italian brother to play their
right,
brothers? It's so offensive, and it makes fun of immigrants' inability to speak fluent English. It holds them up to ridicule. So they should burn the negatives. And anyway, yes, that was his. But see, dialect comedians were a mainstay of comedy at the turn of the century and
right,
the 20th century. So you had Jewish comedians, with like Yiddish accents and coming on. So, but
right.
I went into the delicatessen and the man said to me, "Why do you come here, you mashuga?" That, there'd be that. There'd be, and,
Yes,
there'd be. I mean, Groucho said, and it's funny because I've Googled this and I still can't find anything on it. You'd think, since people have done exhaustive studies of vaudeville acts, but Groucho said there was a group, there was a quartet called the Wang Doodle Four, which were four black guys dressed up as Chinese. And they
I
would
never heard of that.
sing. No, the Wang Doodle Four. I can't find anything on it. But
Maybe that was one
again,
of
nobody.
Groucho's little puns there, little. I'll tell. I'm in a great joking mood right now. I'm going to tell this story to the point where
No, but
they'll
he
believe
wouldn't
it.
make up reminiscences. He would
Right,
do wordplay or say something funny about somebody, but he wouldn't
right,
just fabricate an anecdote about an act because
right,
because his adventures were so interesting. He didn't need to make things up. And
right.
other vaudeville comics like George Burns have talked about Swain's Cats and Rats, which
George
was
Martin.
an
Yeah,
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 sure, sure.
yeah, yeah.
Swain's Rats and Cats, which was cats dressed as horses with rats dressed as jockeys riding
Ah,
on their back. And that
yeah,
you can find references to. They were big, that was big time stuff in vaudeville to get to
yeah.
see Swain's. And in fact, imagine the training and practice that would have to go into getting the rat on the cat's back and getting the cat to tolerate having a rat ride on it.
Oh,
It does
yes,
sound like a
yes.
great act. Burns, yeah, I got to have lunch with Burns at Groucho's house. And
Wow.
it was before the Sunshine Boys, but again, I fully understood who George Burns was because of Burns'
Yes.
talent in films and radio and TV. So I was a little nervous when he came over. And the doorbell rang and I opened it, and there was this little man, and he looked up and he said, "Hi, you want to live a long time? Become an actor. You'll live to be an old man like Groucho with me. Okay, let's eat." And it's like, what put me immediately at ease. And then to sit at
Yeah.
the table and listen to them, Groucho would say, "You remember we were playing B.F. Keith's in Chicago." And Burns would say, "That wasn't B.F. Keith. It was the Orpheum, and it was in Milwaukee because Chico was sleeping with the daughter of the man." No, you're confusing. And, I mean, it was sort of like the Sunshine Boys, except it didn't exist yet. And then
Yeah.
after we were finished eating, Burns took out a cigar and pushed it into the plastic holder and lit it up. And he said, "I never smoke expensive cigars. All I care is if it fits the holder. Now,
Ah,
Milton Berle pays $2 a piece for his cigars. If I spent that much for a cigar, I'd smoke it. I'd sleep
make love.
before I smoked it."
Yes, yes.
Uh,
I actually use that joke every time I do my impression of George Burns on podcasts and stuff.
well, he
And
really said it. He said it at Groucho's lunch table in 1974, and I was there to
wow.
hear it.
And I mean, I do people like, Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah.
I'm very fluent with Rich Little. I mean, I've talked to him several times. I submitted some jokes to
Or
him.
can you do a
And
Rich Little impression?
I can't do a Rich Little impression, but he has actually helped me do a lot of the impressions that he does. Because, I mean, he was fantastic friends with Ronald Reagan, and that's his favorite impression to do.
Yeah.
And he actually had to help me on doing Reagan's impression because I had a hard time with it. And he told me, he said, I had a hard time doing Ronald Reagan at first as well. I just could not get it down. And he said during his campaign, he met one of his staff members at the airport, and she gave him some pointers on how to do Reagan. And he said, Zach, I'm going to give you the same advice this lady gave me. Before you say anything, you have to say, well, and it was just that
That was
those
the
little,
key.
yeah,
Yeah, it was
those
like
little,
nobody did Bob Hope before Dave Thomas did it on SCTV. He was
I
such a,
know
I mean,
this.
Hope's voice is so instantly recognizable, but none of us could do it until we saw Dave Thomas do it, and that unlocked the
Yes.
secret to doing Hope when you end up doing Dave Thomas's Hope. But I'll also do, like I said, I like to do something just to the left or right of the obvious, like in the could have been a contender scene from On the Waterfront. I don't do
Mhm.
Brando, I do Rod Steiger because nobody. What are you
Yeah.
talking about? You saw some money. I had some bets down. It wasn't your night.
Night, I
Yeah.
could have taken him apart.
Anyway, fun with
Rod Steiger. Yes. Yes. Great actor as
You better
well.
make up your mind before we get to 427 River Street.
Before we get
I'll tell him I couldn't find you. I'll tell him, I don't know. Chances are he won't believe me. Anyway, there's children stop me on the street and say, "Do you Rod Steiger?" No, kids, I gotta get home. Well, it's
Yeah,
nice to know
absolutely.
that someone in their 30s likes to do these old guys because I don't really know how you would do a Brad Pitt impression
Well,
or
Rich Little says it like this, and I could not agree more. He says somebody comes up to him and says, do Dustin Hoffman or do Adam Sandler or something. And he says, what do you mean do like Dustin Hoffman, do his character in The Graduate, do him in Hook, do him
yeah,
in, Meet the Pair or Meet the Fockers and stuff. He said everybody these days are playing the same kind of role. And whereas back in the day, John Wayne, Jimmy Stewart, they had their own special
yeah,
persona, but they were playing all these different characters. I mean, John Wayne could do a funny Western
Right.
guy with a different persona than, let's duke it out on, no pun intended, let's duke it out with the guns. Let's be serious.
Right.
Nowadays everyone has their own genre. Like Adam Sandler is mainly strictly comedy. I don't think there's been somebody like those old time stars since Robin Williams, believe it or not. I mean, I think he was one of the greatest actors that could play any role. I mean, his background was comedy,
Yeah.
but he could do anything.
Yeah. He
And
was equally adept at comedy and drama.
yes,
When I think about younger actors and actresses and think they don't have distinct enough voices, then I'll watch SNL and someone will do Drew Barrymore or something like that.
yes,
And I'll realize, no, there is still a way to do some of the younger people. I'm painting with too broad a brush to say that back then they had distinctive voices that you could do impressions of. But these
right.
days you can, that they would do impressions of Matthew Broderick and people, and
Hmm.
it would sound like them, and I'd say, okay, I'll give you that. There is a way to do those people. But
Right.
I'm
I mean,
much more stuck in the 30s.
yeah, I mean, that's how I am. I mean, Jimmy Stewart is probably the easiest one for me to do because, he had the little nose twitch and the hand shaking, and he just had that voice, and not to mention the stutter, that's a very big
George,
key.
you once came to me and said I was nothing but a warped, frustrated old man. Well,
Yeah.
look at yourself. What are you but a warped, frustrated young man? Go home and talk it over with your wife.
um, so yeah, I mean, we've been talking now for over an hour, and
Uh-oh.
the, the
Hey,
last
Zoom hasn't cut us off. That's good.
I know that's great. I mean, I could talk to you for like 5 more hours on everything,
Well, we'll
but
save that for another time, or
yes, we will. I will definitely
with
have you back.
Jeremy.
Yes, yes, most definitely. And I mean, there's a lot of rumors, though. Just one last thing before we wrap this up. There have been a lot of rumors about Groucho with Alice Cooper and something on the set of the Otto Preminger
Oh,
Curiosity
Skidoo,
Skidoo.
yes.
And could you just clarify
Well,
the issue
I
with Alice Cooper?
Well, he and Alice Cooper were friends in the early 70s. And I think part of it was Aaron Fleming wanted Groucho photographed and seen with some of the then young, hot stars to give him, more. It's like, oh, look, there he is with this rock and roll guy. And then, of course, there was the reflected glory of the fact that they were being photographed with Groucho Marx. So, for instance, there's that scene of Queen giving Groucho a copy of the gold record to A Night at the Opera, which
Yes.
ended up on the wall of his den. Um, but it didn't mean that he liked Queen. It meant that he was there for the photo op and was flattered. And likewise with Alice Cooper, he despised rock and roll music. And
Oh,
again,
really?
this is a man from 1890. This is a man
Mhm.
who was friends with Gershwin in Berlin and Kern and Richard Rodgers and Lawrence Harvey.
Right,
So I think he can be forgiven for not being receptive to Bebopaloola and Twist and Shout. Anyway,
right,
it is his prerogative. I mean, there's certain kinds of music I'm not crazy about. So he was one of those that tended to write it off as, a lot of noise instead of melodies. And so
right,
I don't think that he responded to Alice's songs, but he got a big kick out of Alice's act, the
right.
makeup and the outrageousness. And I think he said something like, you're going to bring back vaudeville single-handedly.
Yes. And
So yeah, they would, be at events together and so on. But lately I've been reading that Alice says that Groucho would call Alice in it late at night and have him come over, and they would polish off 6 packs of beer and watch TV.
Hmm.
And it's like, this is very hard for me to accept, because I don't think it was Groucho's style to call someone up like that in the middle of the night and say, come over. Also, even in his youth, Groucho wasn't much of a drinker.
Right.
And he had a very dim view of people who drank to excess. He would dismiss them. He was a good director, but he was a drunk. He'd say something like that. And I know that Alice was using heavily back then. So if he came over, I suspect the 6 packs were polished off only by Alice, and if anyone else happened to be there. But he and Groucho, I cannot believe would be chug-a-lugging,
Oh yeah.
beer.
No.
And then likewise with Skidoo, there's a story that he dropped acid in the making of Skidoo. Well,
That's not Groucho.
as with alcohol, Groucho took a dim view of the younger generation and their recreational drugs, marijuana and cocaine and psychedelics. Also, he was, and this also goes to the thing about avoiding drinking. He didn't like the idea of not having control over what he was saying or doing or thinking.
Yes.
That was that wasn't inviting to him. The idea of, let's just go drink this or swallow this and let's go wild.
Right.
Also, for that generation, they were even more averse to recreational drugs than younger people, because they would hear stories. I think Art Linkletter had a child who took LSD and then jumped off a building, or there was that story that they killed themselves after. So they had an inordinate fear. There were exceptions. I mean, Cary Grant talked about having tried it and used it and gotten something out of it, and that's fine. And I don't doubt him. But knowing Groucho and his aversion to losing control, and also, given his age and the medications he was on and so on, he knew not to mix alcohol, much less recreational drugs. So I don't know whether the story came from someone who was themselves whacked out at that time in their lives and came to think it happened, or we're just trying to make the story more interesting. When I sat down to write Raised Eyebrows, I realized I had the power, if I wanted, to either exaggerate or make things up, because there were so few people still alive to say that didn't happen like that or it never happened. But I felt like telling the story the way it happened was interesting enough, the highs and lows and funny stuff and tragic things, that I didn't need to make things up or make myself more important in the household than I really was.
Right.
But it's a common thing that when you tell a story, it gets embellished over the years. And it's, come to think of it, there was a friend of mine, Jay Hopkins, who interviewed me very shortly after Groucho died, because he put out a newspaper called Marx. And he recently played that tape for me, and that was recorded around 78 or 9, just a year or two after Groucho died. And what I was struck by was how my stories were in content and the way I told them, that they really, I would make a good witness, in a trial, because they wouldn't be able to say, well, it says 6 years ago you gave an interview saying you met Groucho in a helicopter off the coast of Madagascar, and now you're saying it was at UCLA to get animal crack. It's like, it really has remained remarkably consistent. So anyway, with Cooper and with the LSD and with Queen, people will see the pictures and they'll say, "That's so cool. Groucho was so hip," and I could let it go and let them think that of him. But
Right.
I rather would set the record straight. Also, a lot of misquotes. I see so many memes that'll have like a T-shirt or something, and it'll have a quote and then a picture of Groucho, and then I have to tell people, I know it's commonly repeated, but he never said it.
Right.
And it's like, oh, we don't want to hear that. And it's like, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, but as long as I'm around, I'm going to try to set the record straight.
Right.
I have
And
a
I'm
letter.
nothing.
I have a letter from Steve Allen that says, "I hope this sets the record straight, which is more than my Pioneer turntable can do."
Steve Allen was a great, great comedian, and he said that even Harpo, people thought Harpo was actually a deaf mute, but
Yes,
Steve Allen said once he started talking, you couldn't shut him up pretty
that's
much.
funny.
And
Yeah.
I mean, Harpo. I mean, it's weird seeing Harpo on screen. With the smile and the zany antics, how he waves goodbyes, and then
But that was a
hearing him
character
actually talk.
he was playing, but he
Yes,
wasn't like that at the lunch table, But he also could do silly, outrageous things like play
right.
croquet naked, and
Yes,
he seemed to like to take his clothes off a lot. So he did have a silly streak, but in terms of conversing around the table, they weren't in character, although they did
right.
refer to each other by the people asked me, did they call each other Leonard and Julius and Herbert? And like, no, they called each other Chico and Groucho and Zeppelin.
Wow,
So they really did
wow.
adopt the stage names as their real name.
Yes. And just before we go, the one last topic I want to cover, which is very short, and I know I'm gonna bring you on again sometime very soon for the channel, and also Jeremy Wilcox and I are going to interview you for the Fandom Squad. And in that one, I have a lot that I want to ask you about, your works with Carl Gottlieb and people like that. I mean, this interview today, I was trying to focus on your time with Groucho and with
Yeah,
the
but we
Marx
managed to
Brothers.
talk about that other famous quartet from Liverpool too at the
Yes,
same time. So
yes,
famous quartets, the Marx Brothers and the Beatles. So
absolutely,
doesn't get better
yes.
than that.
This,
All
but
right. Well, it was grand chatting with you, and I love your enthusiasm and your interest in all these old guys that younger people would say, yeah, but it's in black and white, and you can't.
I love the black and white things. That makes
I
it
know.
timeless,
I know.
And so any words of wisdom for the viewers out there? Anything that you want to offer them? Advice? Stay
It's
funny or
easier.
whatever.
It's easier to apologize than to get permission.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. I could not agree.
All
Hey,
right.
you
Well,
make your mistakes,
that,
then yeah.
it was
All
most
right.
enjoyable.
Yes. Well, I thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Steve Stoliar, Groucho Marx personal secretary and closest confidant. I thank you so much, Steve, and I look forward to talking to you again.
It's a deal. I'll see you later.
Absolutely. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Oh, I'm back. Anyway, guys, wait a minute. Groucho, you left it in black and white. Modern day color again, please. Now that's better. Hey, guys, I hope you enjoyed the interview. And all I can say is keep the laughs, because we need laughs these days. We can always use a laugh, Anyway, folks, thanks for joining me today. Special thanks to Steve Stoliar for appearing on my channel today. I'm so glad we got a chance to talk to him. We learned a lot. We were able to clarify a lot of the rumors that we heard and hearsay about Groucho and the other Marx Brothers. So I really hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for more incredible impression adventures. See you guys.